Hey everybody. So if you've spent any amount of time browsing crypto YouTube or even Twitter in the past week, there is a reasonable chance that you have seen this video pop up. I even saw somebody talking about it on LinkedIn. I know LinkedIn is dumb. I shouldn't be there. I hear you. This is a video called Line Goes Up, The Problem With NFTs by a YouTuber named Dan Olsen. I didn't know of Olsen till this video, and I won't pretend to know much about his background. But the video itself, the 2-hour, 20-minute video that got 3.5 million views in a week, that I can talk about. Olsen literally made a feature-length video essay explaining pretty clearly and accurately the mechanics of cryptocurrency and many of the failings of the technology and ecosystem before sharing also his view that all of it is a scam, top to bottom, left to right, start to finish, all of it, from Bitcoin right down to the latest rug pull, which is a pretty staggering accusation, honestly, conflating Bitcoin, which was a technological breakthrough solving a decades-old distributed computing problem, and synthesizing ideas from cryptography, economics, psychology, and more, conflating that with some garbage NFT that popped up last week. That's just false. And it betrays an incredible bias that this is somebody who came to the table with an agenda, and no matter how much research they've done, they're new to the topic. Like I said, it's a long video, and I'm not going to respond to all of it here. These are some of my high-level thoughts on the first third of the video. While the title of Olsen's video is The Problem with NFTs, he actually starts way before NFTs, and that's what I'll cover here. It covers the 2008 collapse, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and building a global machine. Olsen starts with an explanation of the 2008 financial collapse that is more or less correct, if incomplete. And this is a theme we'll find throughout his video. Olsen has done his research, he's a smart dude who has the facts, but he's often describing half of the elements at play. For the 2008 collapse, he totally fails to acknowledge that the government might have had something to do with the abundance of cheap mortgages that led to subprime mortgage lending. It's all the big bad corporate guys, you see. It's those fat cats who got us. By Olsen's account, it's never the government, unless he's saying that the regulators simply didn't regulate enough. I don't really want to make this political, but this guy clearly has a hard left lean on everything he says, and it's going to make it very difficult to have a productive conversation. The invention of Bitcoin was a direct response to the 2008 failure of numerous institutions, including the US government and the Federal Reserve. These aren't even ideas that Olsen touches on, and they're fundamental to why cryptocurrency was invented in the first place. So, yeah, hard to have a productive convo. The closest he comes to acknowledging any government role is to say,
"It was a failure precipitated by a combination of greed, active fraud, and willful blindness at all levels of power. The regulatory agencies that should have seen the problem coming were gutted by budget cuts and mired in conflicts of interest as employees use their positions in regulation to secure higher paying jobs in industry."
He makes a half attempt to illustrate the critical of government stance here.
"The hyper-capitalist or anarcho-capitalist argument is that in a less constrained market, there would be more incentive to call foul, that regulation had only succeeded in creating an in-group that was effectively able to conspire without competition."
But can't help but take one last pot shot at that stance before moving on.
Of course, this argument fails to consider that a substantial number of people within the system did, in fact, get fabulously wealthy specifically by betting against the synthetic cess of the market.
Regardless, all of this is a preamble to explain the context that Bitcoin came from. He then goes on to explain the mechanics of blockchain technology, and again, he gets those mechanics correct. He's even quite good at explaining them until he gets to his opinion of those systems.
In the 12 years since then, none of that played out as designed.
Olsen says this as though the massive increase in value and adoption in crypto hasn't meant anything. Like it didn't happen. Did the internet spring forth fully formed circa 1996? Or email? Technology networks take time to mature and spread. They even have some bubbles along the way. These networks, these technologies, these systems have had to evolve with growing pains and everything. To say that nothing played out as designed is absurdly dismissive for the invention of an entirely new asset class that everybody, the finance world, government, the world in general, is taking seriously. His characterization is just inaccurate.
Bitcoin was structurally too slow and expensive to handle regular commerce.
I guess this is accurate in that it's past tense. It was too slow, and acknowledged as such almost immediately by those building the technology. The Lightning Network, a layer 2 network built on top of Bitcoin, solves this entirely. The Lightning Network is something we should definitely talk about more at length in a future video, but for our purposes here, suffice it to say that the Lightning Network makes Bitcoin fast, cheap, scalable, and even more private than it had been. It addresses Olsen's Bitcoin's criticisms, and more. So Olsen is leaning on old information here, and he gets some of his history wrong.
The whole thing basically came out the gate as a speculative financial vehicle.
This is false. Most early Bitcoin adopters, even if they cerebrally thought that Bitcoin would increase in value, they had a really hard time believing it would increase in value. I remember because I was there. I first learned about Bitcoin in 2011. I only really got into it in 2013, and I did not put all of my chips in and say, this is going to make me rich. Virtually everyone I know from that period was the same way. We all figured it would increase in value, but it wasn't why we were interested. When Bitcoin started, it wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It was an ideological revolution, questioning what money was and what it could and should be. The only people I can immediately identify as smart speculators who were very, very early in the Bitcoin world were the Winklevoss twins, who totally went all in and never looked back. Good for them. Speaking of the Winklevi, for whatever reason, Olsen decides to baselessly call them, quote, old money. So, serious question, what exactly have the Winklevi done to be called? I'm serious. Name one thing. Ben Mesrick's book, Bitcoin Billionaires, goes into their history, and it's a brilliant book, a sequel of sorts to his book, The Accidental Billionaires, which the movie The Social Network was based on. I eagerly look forward to some kind of screen adaptation for Bitcoin Billionaires. It's a great story. But back to the point, for me, as somebody who's been in the space for almost a decade, having read the books and watched documentaries, and yes, even meeting many of these people and making a documentary on the topic myself, I fail to think of one thing the Winklevoss twins have done to deserve being called, unless he thinks they're simply for wanting to make money and being hardworking and successful and Olympians. That's what I actually think Olsen objects to here. It's the optics. He doesn't like how they look. He doesn't like Bitcoin's vibe. So he's just going to denigrate anybody involved. Olsen points to some of the seedier characters in the cryptocurrency world, going so far as to insinuate that the appeal of sound money is actually anti-Semitic.
Peter Thiel, who also went from wealthy to ultra wealthy off the Web2 boom via PayPal, loves crypto and is friends with a bunch of eugenics advocates who promote cryptocurrency as a return to sound money.
That's right. If you think money needs to be fixed, it's because you're racist. Welcome to 2022, folks. That's just how people think today, and apparently, it's acceptable. Never mind that later in the video, he points to examples of cryptocurrency helping people of all ethnicities all over the world, only to then immediately say that it's all just theatrics. These examples of cryptocurrency-associated people that he doesn't like and finds distasteful, those are real. Those represent the crypto world. Jordan Belfort is an archetypal crypto bro, really, as though he wasn't the wolf of actual Wall Street, like he doesn't represent the financial world that this whole thing was, and I hope still is, a rejection of. But also, these impoverished brown people in Central and South America or Africa that are using cryptocurrency as sound money and a means of preserving the fruits of their labor, well, that's just astroturfing, you see. Nothing real about it, just fabricated PR from some Silicon Valley fintech bros. Olsen is doing the exact thing he quickly accuses others of. He's not being critical of his own assumptions. His description of proof of work is accurate. It's a good explanation. His explanation of the shortcomings of that system are misdirected at best.
Critics pointed out that this created new problems. Adversarial validation would deliberately incur escalating processing costs, which would in turn generate perverse structural incentives that would quickly reward capital holders and lock out any individual that wasn't already obscenely wealthy, because while the escalating proof of work scheme incurs heavy diminishing returns are still returns. So more would always go to those with the resources to build the bigger rig. No matter what Bitcoin future was envisioned, in the here and now, computer hardware can be bought with dollars.
Does crypto mining incentivize larger players to invest in their operations to make more of the profits? Yes, as does any profitable venture. This isn't really a criticism of Bitcoin, but a frustration with competition and business generally. Olsen apparently doesn't like business or money, especially in the hands of people who see the world differently than he does.
Rather than dismantling corrupt power structures, this would just become a new tool for existing wealth.
We're going to have a hard time agreeing or disagreeing on this unless we can define which corrupt power structures we're talking about. Banks are one that he doesn't seem to like. They also didn't like Bitcoin, or haven't until recently when it's become clear it's not going away. He seems to have very little problem with government and the Federal Reserve. Barely mentions them. So it's going to be hard for him to see that Bitcoin is a solution to the problem that they've created.
These rigs draw an industrial amount of power.
Ah, yes, of course. The Bitcoin is boiling the ocean argument. argument. I've addressed this in a prior video. Suffice it to say, this whole argument is bizarrely overblown because I have news. All human activity requires power. The servers running YouTube require an industrial amount of power, as does Twitter or Facebook or Reddit. Very few parties ever object to the electricity usage of the internet generally. That criticism is reserved for Bitcoin because they don't like Bitcoin, so it must be a waste. Really, check my other video on this. The whole thing strikes me as bizarre and utterly lacking the context that everything uses power. To his credit, he gives brief voice to the counter-argument here.
Evangelists will counter that the global banking industry also uses a lot of power,
and then immediately follows that up with a bad faith comparison of Bitcoin's transactions per second compared to Visa's transactions per second, and the fractions of a penny that a Visa swipe costs compared to a Bitcoin transaction. These aren't real comparisons because they're not the same thing. A settled Bitcoin transaction is settled. It's done. A Visa transaction is conditionally done in a few seconds, but it isn't actually settled for days or weeks and is subject to the approvals of numerous middle parties and all of the electricity necessary to keep those businesses operating, which the critics never bring up. He also characterizes Bitcoin as the hobby horse for a few 100,000 gambling addicts. Right, because hodling is gambling. You're totally right. It's indistinguishable from roulette. If it weren't abundantly clear, Olsen has no interest in being nuanced or balanced. This man eagerly takes potshots at the crypto crowd every chance he gets. We already talked about his characterization of the Winklevoss twins. Now he takes a potshot at Vitalik Buterin.
In 2012, Vitalik Buterin, a crypto enthusiast and butthurt warlock main,
there are plenty of valid points of criticism against Vitalik and his choices, but the fact that he was really invested in World of Warcraft as a teenager is not one of them. Even his detractors admit Buterin is a genius, a savant, and what Olsen is criticizing is something that happened when Buterin was 13. So yeah, cool. Make fun of a savant teen who's likely on the spectrum. Great move. And brace yourselves for this next one. This is something.
This heady, high-minded philosophy is outlined in great detail in the journalistic abortion, The Infinite Machine, by failed journalist turned crypto shill Camila Russo.
What an outright thing to say. Disagree with people all you want, but this is just incredibly mean, bad faith name calling. I've met Russo briefly. She's a lovely person and a very capable journalist. While writing this, I mentioned to my wife that Olsen was doing this kind of name calling, and she said it sounded like Tucker Carlson on Fox News. She's right, and not the first person to make exactly that comparison. It's just partisan hackery, trying to score points against the other team. If you're trying to advance a cause, this kind of thing doesn't help.
The book is actually really interesting. Not for the merits of the writing, Russo fails to interrogate the validity or rationality of even the simplest claims and falls just shy of hagiography by occasionally noting that something was a bit tacky or embarrassing, but only just shy.
Bro, she failed to interrogate the validity of her claims? Look in a mirror, Dan. I'm stooping to Olsen's level here, but people on Twitter have even pointed out that Olsen bears a hilarious resemblance to a liberal internet pseudo-intellectual Wojak.
They don't understand anything about the ecosystems they're trying to disrupt. They only know that these are things that can be conceptualized as valuable and assume that because they understand one very complicated thing, programming with cryptography, that all other complicated things must be lesser in complexity and naturally lower in the hierarchy of reality, nails easily driven by the hammer that they have created.
Again, a mirror for you to look into.
The fact that Russo fails to question any of this is journalistic malpractice.
Not sure if you're aware of the present state of journalism, but actual journalistic malpractice, like willful dishonesty, is rampant in major journalistic institutions today, including virtually all media covering Bitcoin's energy usage, which you also engaged in earlier in this video. You are doing the thing you're accusing others of.
Bitcoin sucks.
This man utterly fails to understand what Bitcoin is, the problem it's aimed at solving, or the power structures behind that problem. He doesn't even attempt to address them. His criticism of blockchain as a secure means of tracking things, there's some good criticism here, and this sheds light on a broader dynamic. When a new technology is developed, the proponents will imagine a future where that technology solves everything. And it is a grand, bold, beautiful future where their technology is driving the entire world. Those people are overly optimistic and usually disappointed. Then there are people like Dan who think it's all a scam and anything new can't be trusted. Those people are too pessimistic. The reality will land somewhere in the middle. This technology won't be suited for everything, but for the things that it is uniquely suited for, it will potentially dominate the entire world for those use cases.
The biggest issue that cryptocurrencies have suffered from is a lack of tangible things to actually use them on as currencies, rent or food or transit. This is for pretty simple reasons. One is that the transaction fees on popular chains are so prohibitive that it's pointless to use them on any transaction that isn't hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. No one is going to buy the Bitcoin bucket from their local KFC. Ethereum's main transaction fee, called gas, on a good day runs around $20 US per transaction. But that's severely optimistic. As of December 2021, the daily average cost of gas hasn't gone below $50 US since August, with the 3-month daily average riding over $130.
He's right about this. Cryptocurrency hasn't really taken off as currency in the real-world economy, despite what many of us early adopters thought. And transaction fees, especially on Ethereum, are insane. Ethereum has a whole host of layer 2 solutions that will supposedly solve this issue, and the Bitcoin Lightning Network is solving this for Bitcoin. But he's right. Primarily, cryptocurrency hasn't been adopted as currency. It has, however, worked amazingly well as money, a store of value rather than a means of exchange. Important distinction and just as valid as currency. To learn more about that distinction, click my video up here. This man fundamentally fails to understand the ideas that drove Bitcoin and by extension other cryptocurrencies in the first place. He really thinks this is just a get-rich-quick scheme. And to a latecomer, that may be exactly what it looks like. But that's not what drew people in years ago, and it certainly wouldn't have been why they stuck around. Bitcoin was a rejection of centralized management of money in general. There's a reason so many early adopters were anti-Fed libertarians. And look where we are now. As it turns out, Bitcoin has been a fantastic hedge against failing fiat currencies. Better than anything else on earth, actually. He keeps thinking people are just in this to flip their Bitcoins for more dollars. He apparently hasn't seen the Matrix meme or ever heard Eric Voorhees speak.
The point is not to make a bunch of money. There's a lot of ways to do that in life. The point is to actually change how money works and how finance works and how the entire global economic exchange apparatus works at a fundamental level.
Voorhees understood the objections to Bitcoin as money, and our boy Olsen needs to go back and take a Bitcoin 101 class from Eric Voorhees.
Cryptocurrency is a bigger fool's scam.
Olsen's persistent argument is that because there are scammers in the space, then the whole thing is a scam. That it's dangerous and underdeveloped and undermines existing power structures and institutions, and it's all bad, 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 bad. But was the American West a scam? Was the nascent internet a scam? He's not wrong about a lot of this. Many of the specific criticisms are valid, but his broad thesis and conclusions are wrong. And none of his criticisms, even his most valid points, none of it will stop cryptocurrency from winning. You can be specifically right and directionally wrong. You can get the details right and get the story wrong. Colloquially, we would call this missing the forest for the trees or throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that's exactly what Olsen does. He's also needlessly mean, which is not cool. Olsen is not the first person to do this, to get specifics right and direction wrong. Many brilliant people did this with the internet itself. They were correct in their specific criticism of where the nascent internet was weak and broken, but they were wrong to think that that would stop the internet from finding adoption. Olsen will, in due time, find himself in the same camp, and he will undoubtedly describe all of the reasons that he was really right all along. It's the world who misunderstood. You see, it's you guys who are wrong. Ignore people like this as much as you can. I know that's easier said than done. I am making this response video after all. This only covers the first 1/3 of Olsen's 2-hour 20-minute video. The rest of it is on NFTs and DAOs. Should I dive in, yay or nay? It's ugly work, but maybe somebody needs to do it. Let me know down in the comments and we'll get to all of this in a future video. Thanks, team.